Who the hell let you in? The question wasn't whispered. It wasn't a subtle dig exchanged between confidants. It was a verbal grenade tossed into the heart of the Apex Innovators Summit Gala, detonating with enough force to make the holographic orchestra flicker. The sound, sharp and ugly, sliced through the curated hum of networking and champagne flutes, a shard of glass in a symphony of progress. Heads, adorned with diamonds and legacy, swiveled towards the epicenter of the disruption. She stood there, a vision in ice-white silk, a dress so stark it seemed to absorb the light around it. Tiffany von Astor. 26 years old, the new wife of a tech billionaire, her face a perfect polished mask of surgical enhancements and inherited arrogance. She looked the black woman standing before her up and down, her gaze a slow, contemptuous inventory, as if she'd found vermin scuttling across the pristine white marble of her penthouse. A few nervous titters rippled through the nearby circles of influence. The clinking of crystal suddenly sounded harsh, brittle. But Saraphina James, the woman in the emerald gown, stood unmoving in the eye of the storm. Her dress wasn't white, the color of sterile wealth. It was the deep, living green of a forest after rain, structured yet flowing, a statement of life and resilience. Her hair was braided into an intricate crown, not a style meant for passing trends, but one that spoke of heritage, of strength woven into every strand. The insult landed, a poison dart aimed at her heart, but she didn't so much as flinch. This look, this question, it was a ghost she knew intimately. It had haunted her in the hallowed halls of an Ivy League university, where she was one of 3 black women in the entire physics program. It had whispered in the sterile boardrooms of Silicon Valley, where her ideas were dismissed until a white man repeated them. And now, here it was again, in a state-of-the-art convention hall in Dubai, a place supposedly dedicated to the future, draped in the ugly trappings of the past. Tiffany leaned in, her voice a sickly, sweet syrup. Next time, darling, you might want to try something. Less. You wouldn't want people to think you're trying to be seen. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. You are not one of us. You do not belong in the light. Gasps, quickly disguised as coughs, smirks, hidden behind sips of vintage champagne. The air crackled with the delicious, terrible thrill of a public takedown. And yet, Saraphina James stood her ground, her presence a silent, powerful force that seemed to suck the air out of Tiffany's performance. She didn't answer, not with a word. Her silence wasn't a void, it was a pressure chamber, building, waiting. Before we go any deeper into this story, I have to ask, where are you joining us from today? Let us know your city, your state, your country down in the comments. We are a global family here. And if you believe that dignity is non-negotiable and that justice should be served, no matter how rich the offender is, then do me a favor. Hit that like button and smash that subscribe button until it turns blue. These stories need to be heard, and your support makes you a part of the change. We're so damn glad you're here. Now, back to the gala. The holographic musicians, after their brief falter, resumed their melody, but the notes felt hesitant now, tiptoeing around the crater of tension. A server, a young man from the Philippines balancing a tray of molecular gastronomy creations, instinctively altered his path, giving the 2 women a wide berth. Composure versus cruelty, the silent battle lines were drawn. Phones, once tucked away, were now angled discreetly, their dark screens capturing the clash of emerald and ice. On a mezzanine level overlooking the floor, a veteran journalist for a major tech publication deleted his fluffy opening paragraph about innovation and typed a new, single line in his notes. Old money ugliness infects new tech paradise. Power play on the floor. But Saraphina said nothing. Her eyes, calm and observant, did a slow, deliberate scan of the room. She wasn't here for a verbal brawl beneath billion-dollar LED installations. She was here to observe, to measure, to let the night unmask itself, to give arrogance the rope it so desperately craved to hang itself with. And so she stood, a pillar of quiet strength wrapped in emerald silk, while the very atmosphere around her grew taut with the unbearable weight of what would happen next. The Apex Innovators Summit Gala was designed to intimidate. It was held in Dubai's newly unveiled Sphere of Tomorrow, a marvel of architecture where walls were living data screens and the ceiling was a star-field simulation so real you felt you could fall into the cosmos. This wasn't a night for humble beginnings. It was a night for established gods of industry where a handshake could seal a 9-figure deal and a nod could bankrupt a nation. And into this pantheon of power, Saraphina James had walked, a quiet storm in a sea of boisterous black ties and predictable designer gowns. She had no entourage, no nervous assistant clutching a tablet, just one woman, moving with the unshakable calm of someone who had faced down dragons and walked away with their fire. Her emerald dress didn't scream for attention. It commanded it, the way a majestic, ancient tree commands a clearing. It didn't ask for your gaze. It simply held it. Every step she took on the polished floor was a study in precision, as if she were walking on a path she had mapped out decades ago, while everyone else was still fumbling with the directions. Earlier, a junior executive, eager to network, had nearly backed into her. She'd sidestepped with fluid grace, and he, turning to apologize, had found himself momentarily speechless. There was an aura about her, an intensity that her serene expression didn't quite hide. "My apologies," he'd stammered. She had simply nodded, her eyes offering a flicker of acknowledgement that was both warm and deeply profound. He felt, absurdly, as though he'd been seen, truly seen, for the first time all night. That small moment of grace, that recognition of another human being in a room full of avatars, spoke more about her power than any jewel could. Around her, the theater of status was in full swing. Venture capitalists performed congeniality. Startup founders pitched their dreams with a desperate sheen in their eyes. Government ministers from a dozen nations traded promises wrapped in diplomatic smiles. And Tiffany von Astor, a supernova in her icy white dress, was the star of her own show. She drifted between clusters of power, her diamond earrings flashing like strobes, her laughter a perfectly pitched instrument designed to capture attention. She touched arms, whispered into ears, her every move a calculated play for relevance. Saraphina saw it all, but she remained an observer. She had arrived alone, her name not on the publicly displayed guest list. She wore no lanyard, carried no clutch with a gaudy logo. To the casual observer, she was an enigma, perhaps a +1, an outsider who had somehow slipped past the velvet ropes. And that was precisely her intent. Because tonight, beneath the simulated starlight and the hum of revolutionary tech, wasn't about charity or celebration. It was about reconnaissance. It was a final test. Her mind drifted back, a brief, sharp memory. A tiny, underfunded startup office in Austin, Texas, 15 years ago. She was 25, wearing a cheap blazer, her hands shaking as she pitched her revolutionary data encryption algorithm to a room of dismissive, smirking men in expensive suits. One of them had interrupted her, not to ask a question, but to say, "Honey, this is cute, but you don't have the gravitas to play in this league." They hadn't just rejected her idea, they had rejected her existence in their world. She hadn't argued, she hadn't cried. She had walked out of that room and, in the silence of her tiny apartment, she had started building her own league. An empire built not on who you knew, but on what you could create. Now she stood in another room, being mistaken for less than she was, but the script had changed. This time, she was the one holding the pen. From the glass-walled mezzanine above, the veteran journalist, a man named Marcus Thorne, was typing furiously on his tablet. An anonymous source had leaked the summit's financials earlier that day. A single, colossal investment had bankrolled nearly 70% of the entire event, including the cutting-edge tech on display. The donor was listed only as Aegis. Marcus hadn't yet connected the dots, but his reporter's instinct told him the answer was not in the spreadsheets, but down on that floor, standing calm and unassuming, in a gown the color of deep, resilient life. Across the hall, Tiffany von Astor spotted her again. A flash of irritation crossed her perfect features. How dare this woman continue to exist so peacefully in her space? She whispered something venomous to the sycophants orbiting her. Their heads turned in unison, their eyes narrowing, studying Saraphina as if she were a glitch in their perfect social matrix. But the woman in emerald didn't retreat. She lifted her chin, her gaze steady, her posture unwavering. She had come here tonight to be underestimated. She had come to let their prejudice be the tool of their own undoing. And the night, so full of its own glittering self-importance, had no idea that the real main event had already begun. The music swelled, holographic violins painting the air with practiced elegance, but a dissonant chord of tension now resonated through the hall. Tiffany von Astor, trailed by her coterie, drifted closer, her white dress a predatory shimmer against the ambient light. She held her champagne flute not like a guest, but like a weapon, tilted and ready. She stopped, positioning herself directly in Saraphina's path. "Oh," she exclaimed, her voice amplified for the benefit of the room. "It's you again." Her smile was a masterpiece of cosmetic dentistry, all gleam and no warmth. The words were dipped in saccharin, but their edges were razor-sharp. She gestured expansively to the donors and tech moguls beside her. "This is what I simply adore about these global summits. The sheer variety of attendees." A deliberate pause, followed by a light, airy laugh. "Some of us arrive with a legacy. Others, it seems, arrive with just a dress." The circle around her chuckled, a well-rehearsed chorus of approval, though a few of them let their eyes dart away, a flicker of discomfort in their expressions. Saraphina remained perfectly still, her breathing even, her gaze a steady anchor in a sea of performative cruelty. Her profound calmness had the strange effect of making Tiffany's mockery sound crass and loud, like a drunk shouting in a library. "Where are you seated, darling?" Tiffany pressed on, her voice dripping with false concern. "I don't believe I saw your name on the list for the platinum tables. Perhaps somewhere in the back, near the coat check?" The insult was layered, a velvet rope being pulled tight, publicly cordoning Saraphina off from the world of importance. Near the raw bar, a young coder muttered to his colleague, "That's brutal." A server, carefully arranging a pyramid of glasses, froze for a second, his eyes flicking between the woman in white and the woman in green. The silent, one-sided confrontation was now a spectacle, drawing more and more eyes. Phones were no longer discreet. They were being held up, their small red recording lights blinking like malevolent fireflies. A young woman whispered to her date, "She hasn't said a single word. And yet, she's controlling this whole interaction more than the one in white." Tiffany, sensing she was winning, leaned in for the kill, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Don't you worry. Not everyone is meant for these circles. Some of us are born into them. Some of us marry into them." She paused, letting her diamond ring catch the light. "And others, well, they just seem to wander in, hoping for a free drink." The laughter that followed was louder, more confident. Tiffany bathed in it, her shoulders back, her chin held high. She had successfully turned the Gala into her personal coliseum, and Saraphina was the gladiator she had chosen for slaughter. But Saraphina was no gladiator. She was the architect of the entire arena. Her stillness wasn't submission. It was a profound, unshakable defiance, refined into the art of silence. Up on the mezzanine, Marcus Thorne typed another note. Social hierarchy being weaponized. Von Aster wife on the attack. Target remains impassive. Room is turning. Down below, a security chief near the main entrance spoke quietly into his wristcom. Keep an eye on the central floor. The Von Aster party, something's brewing. Tiffany tilted her flute, taking a slow, theatrical sip, her eyes glittering with the thrill of her perceived victory. Do enjoy the champagne, dear, she purred. Given the price of that dress, it's likely the most expensive thing you'll touch all night. A sharp, collective intake of breath swept through the onlookers. Even the holographic orchestra seemed to stumble, a violin screeching a painful, off-key note. And still, Saraphina James said nothing. Her silence was now a physical presence, a weight pressing down on the hall, daring anyone else to fill the void. The escalation wasn't about shouting or overt aggression. It was in the calculated cruelty of whispers made loud, in the social ostracism performed as sport, in the drawing of a line between those who allegedly belonged and those who did not. And Tiffany Von Aster had just drawn that line across the floor of a building she thought she ruled. But the line she drew was the very stage Saraphina had been waiting for them to build. The cruel laughter hung in the air, shallow and brittle, echoing beneath the simulated constellations that had borne witness to eons of silent, cosmic power. But Saraphina James did not break. With a movement of surgical precision, her hand reached out, not in aggression, but in a gesture of absolute calm. She adjusted the base of her water glass, a micro-movement that seemed to align her entire being with the gravitational pull of the room. She took a slow, deep breath, a breath that held no trace of anger, no hint of fear. It was the breath of a deep-sea diver, calm and measured, conserving oxygen for the depths. She didn't respond to the jab about the dress. She didn't meet Tiffany's gloating stare. Instead, her gaze drifted past her tormentor, across the sea of faces, towards the massive, floor-to-ceiling data screen that displayed the summit's sponsors. Her name wasn't visible, not in letters, not yet. But she knew it was there, woven into the very code that made the screen glow, a sleeping giant waiting for the signal to awaken. Tiffany tilted her head, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. This wasn't the reaction she'd engineered. She was accustomed to tears, to angry retorts, to flustered denials. Silence, this profound and unshakable, was a language she didn't understand, a weapon she hadn't anticipated. Seraphina's stillness was more unnerving than any shouted insult could ever be. She stood there in her emerald silk, a living statue of grace under fire, refusing to be extinguished. A service drone hummed past, offering a tray of delicate, bioluminescent desserts. Saraphina, without breaking her composure, reached out and took one. Her movement was unhurried, steady. She placed it gently on her side plate. It was a mundane action, but in this supercharged atmosphere, it was a declaration. It screamed, "I am not rattled. This is nothing. You are nothing." Around them, the tone of the whispers began to shift. A powerful hedge fund manager near the orchestra pit leaned towards his wife. "She hasn't said a thing," he murmured, "but I feel like I'm watching a masterclass in power." His wife nodded, her eyes locked on Seraphina's composed face. For the first time, Tiffany von Aster faltered. Her smile tightened at the edges. She took another sip of champagne, a little too quickly this time, the rim of the glass clinking audibly against her teeth. And Saraphina simply let the silence do its work. She understood the physics of an unanswered insult. It doesn't dissipate. It boomerangs, gaining mass and momentum with every passing second until it returns to its source. It forced the entire room to marinate in its own discomfort, to truly see the ugliness of the attack. Some guests, who had initially been amused, now began to frown. Their discomfort was no longer directed at the silent woman in green, but at the loud woman in white. The cruelty, once disguised as a clever social play, now looked cheap, vulgar, under the clarifying glare of Saraphina's defiance. Saraphina briefly glanced up at the simulated starfield on the ceiling. Its nebulae and galaxies swirled, scattering light across her gown. The deep green fabric shimmered, looking less like silk and more like burnished, unbreakable armor. A memory surfaced, unbidden. She was 28, presenting a keynote at a tech conference in Berlin. She had been the only woman, the only person of color, on the main stage. Afterward, a prominent investor had approached her, not to praise her work, but to tell her, "You're very articulate, for one of them." He had meant it as a compliment. She hadn't corrected him. She hadn't screamed. She had learned a vital lesson that day. Patience turns their condescension into their confession. That lesson was breathing through her now, in this hall, under these false stars. Tiffany, desperate to regain control, desperate to fill the void that was now swallowing her, leaned in again. "Cat got your tongue, darling?" she sneered. "Or are you just not used to conversations this elevated?" But Saraphina didn't move. Not a twitch of a muscle, not a flicker of an eyelid. She let Tiffany's words hang there, limp and pathetic, in a room that was no longer applauding her cruelty. This wasn't submission. This was a siege, the kind of absolute control earned over a lifetime of being underestimated and of walking out of every fire not burned, but forged. And in that protracted, silent moment, the very soul of the gala seemed to shift. The guests grew restless. The orchestra's melody faded into an awkward pause. Even the lighting seemed to sharpen, to become less forgiving. The silence was no longer awkward. It was an exhibition of authority. At first, the room tried to ignore it. The powerful are adept at pretending not to see what makes them uncomfortable. Conversation stuttered and then restarted a few feet away. Laughter, strained and artificial, was deployed like a smokescreen. But tension is not so easily dismissed. It's a chemical reaction. It spreads. On the mezzanine, Marcus Thorne stopped typing and switched his device to video mode. He had been assigned a puff piece about the future of AI, not a story about a social execution. But the moment he heard, "Cat got your tongue?" his journalistic instincts took over. He pressed record. The small red light blinked, a silent witness capturing the unshakable stillness of the woman in emerald and the desperate, sharp-edged posture of the woman in white. Down on the floor, one of the servers, the young man from Manila, lingered near a pillar, his tray of empty glasses forgotten. He wasn't supposed to stop, but he couldn't look away. His eyes were locked on the exchange. Under his breath, so quiet it was barely a vibration in the air, he muttered, "That is not right." Another staff member, a woman polishing glasses behind the bar, shot him a warning look. Then her own gaze was drawn back to the scene, her polishing cloth still. Staff weren't paid to have opinions, but raw injustice has a way of making everyone a witness. Near the silent auction displays, 2 guests had turned their bodies completely, abandoning their own conversation. One, a young, brilliant coder from Brazil in a vibrant blue dress, whispered to her companion, "Why are they all just letting this happen?" Her companion, a seasoned venture capitalist, frowned, his eyes narrowed. "Because she's different," he said, his voice low, "and because she isn't giving them the satisfaction of a fight." Tiffany von Aster, oblivious to the turning tide, was basking in her own performance. But the cracks in her audience were beginning to show. More phones were emerging, held up with less and less subtlety. The reflections of the simulated stars shimmered in their dark screens. Every second of Saraphina's silence was being captured, documented, ready to be broadcast. Marcus Thorne on the mezzanine whispered into the mic on his lapel, dictating notes for his live blog. Gala floor divided. Unidentified woman in green being publicly berated by Tiffany von Aster. Astonishingly, she has yet to say a single word. Entire room is now watching. Even the musicians, meant to be oblivious, felt it. The lead cellist, an older woman with decades of experience playing for the elite, lost her place in the score, her bow trembling slightly. She glanced toward Saraphina, a flicker of something, empathy, respect in her eyes, before quickly looking back at her music, her cheeks flushed with a faint, embarrassed pink. And then, the first audible crack in the wall of silent complicity. A man in a tailored gray suit, a tech CEO from South Korea seated near the stage, called out. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, and it cut through the nervous hum. "She has said nothing to you. Perhaps you should let her be." A collective gasp. Heads swiveled. The billionaire's wife stiffened, the mask of amused superiority slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the raw fury beneath, before she plastered on another brittle smile. Saraphina remained still, her silence unbroken, but her eyes flickered for a brief moment to the man who had spoken, a quiet acknowledgement of his small, significant act of courage. Whispers now rolled through the room like a tidal surge. "Someone's filming this. This is going to be on Twitter in minutes. That woman in green, who the hell is she?" Tiffany laughed, a sound too bright, too sharp, trying to drown out the murmurs. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, everyone. We're just having a bit of fun." But her tone rang hollow now, defensive. In the corner, the head of security spoke into his comm again, his voice more urgent. "We may have a situation developing on the main floor. I need eyes everywhere." And just like that, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. What had started as a private, cruel insult had metastasized into a public spectacle. Witnesses were no longer passive. They had been activated, not with shouts or fists, but with the quiet, modern-day weapons of cameras, murmurs, and the simple, courageous act of saying, "This is not right." Saraphina had let it all unfold. She hadn't needed to raise her voice. The room was finally starting to find its own. The tension didn't cool. It thickened, turning into a suffocating smog of judgment. Tiffany von Aster's grip on her champagne flute was now white-knuckled. The smirk was a rictus, a desperate holding pattern on her lips, but she would not, could not let silence be the victor. Her voice rang out, louder, more shrill, playing not to her circle anymore, but to the entire captive audience. "These summits should be for people who understand refinement," she declared, raising her chin, "not for interlopers who wander in wearing jungle colors." Her friends laughed, but the sound was weak, uncertain, like a nervous echo. Saraphina remained a statue of composure, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her plate. No answer. No retreat. Her silence was a flawless mirror, and in its reflection, Tiffany's cruelty grew uglier and more distorted with every passing second. Tiffany pushed harder, her desperation making her reckless. Events like this are delicate ecosystems. One inappropriate element can tarnish the entire brand. It's about maintaining standards, isn't it? She let the word standards hang in the air, heavy and poisoned with unspoken prejudice. From the edge of the crowd, a young woman muttered, "She needs to stop." A man beside her shushed her, but his own eyes were narrowed in disgust at the woman in white. The orchestra had gone completely silent now, the holographic musicians frozen with their instruments poised, as if the code itself was waiting to see how the human drama would resolve. And then came an escalation designed not just to wound, but to permanently stain. Tiffany took a deliberate step closer, feigning a clumsy misstep. She tilted her glass, not a little, but a lot. A slow, deliberate ribbon of crimson liquid, a raspberry cocktail, not champagne, arced through the air and splattered across the bodice of Saraphina's emerald gown. The gasp was universal, as sharp as a blade tearing silk. A group of guests physically recoiled. Someone hissed, "Oh no, she did not just do that." Saraphina lowered her eyes, her gaze falling to the dark red stain spreading like a wound against the deep green fabric. Her face remained a mask of impenetrable calm. She picked up her linen napkin and dabbed at the spill once, a single, precise gesture. Nothing more. No outrage, no tears, no collapse. Tiffany tilted her head, her voice dripping with the most grotesque faux apology. "Oh, my darling, I am just so clumsy. These things happen when one gets a little too excited, don't they?" Her laugh was brittle, a sound shattering against a wall of silent condemnation. From the mezzanine, Marcus Thorne whispered into his phone, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Escalation confirmed. It was a deliberate spill. The crowd is turning on her." His live stream chat was a torrent of fury. "That was 100% on purpose. Keep recording. Get her name." At the silent auction table, the young coder from Brazil was now on her feet. "That was not an accident," she said, her voice firm and clear. Heads whipped in her direction. Tiffany von Aster's smile finally faltered, her eyes darting nervously. Saraphina looked up slowly, her eyes calm, patient, and utterly unshaken. Her silence was now the eye of a hurricane, the terrifying stillness before the storm wall hits. The guests were no longer just watching. They were judging. Tiffany had played her final, desperate card. She believed humiliation would be the checkmate. She was too blind to see that she hadn't ended the game. She had just lit the fuse on a bomb, and the room, heavy with judgment, was the blast chamber. The dark red stain on the emerald silk was still wet, a stark symbol of the night's ugliness, when Tiffany von Aster decided that even that was not enough. Her laughter grew sharper, a grating sound that sliced through the charged atmosphere of the hall. "Perhaps you should just go outside and get some air, darling," she said, her voice pitched as a command disguised as a suggestion. "We wouldn't want anyone to think the Apex Summit has lost its sense of decorum." She gestured with a flick of her wrist toward the grand entrance, a casual, dismissive motion that treated Saraphina not as a person, but as a piece of trash to be disposed of. And then, the final, irrevocable strike. Tiffany snapped her fingers, a sharp, ugly sound that summoned the uniformed floor manager. He approached, his face a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes flickered nervously between the two women. Tiffany's smile was the kind that did not ask for obedience. It expected it. "Please escort this woman out," she commanded, her voice loud enough for the simulated stars to hear. "She clearly doesn't belong in this room." The gasp that followed wasn't scattered. It was a single, unified wave of disbelief and shock that rolled across the entire gala. A prominent investor near the front whispered, "Did she just—" Another murmured, "In public? At an event of this magnitude?" The floor manager froze. His hand started to lift, as if to gesture toward Saraphina, but he didn't touch her. Something in her posture anchored, absolute, radiating a power he couldn't name but could feel in his bones, stopped him cold. Tiffany, sensing his hesitation, leaned in closer to Saraphina, her white sequins flashing like warning lights. Her voice dropped to a venomous, private whisper, meant only for her target, but overheard by those closest. "Women like you need to learn your place, and it isn't here." It was the line that finally fractured the night. On the mezzanine, the live stream chat exploded. "Oh my God, it's on camera! Racist! This will be viral before morning." On the floor, the Brazilian coder's voice rang out again, louder this time, trembling with indignation. "You can't throw her out. She has more right to be here than you do." Her words cracked open the dam of silence. Nods, murmurs of agreement, and even a smattering of applause broke out near the back. Saraphina remained perfectly still. Her gown was stained. Her dignity was immaculate. In her mind, a memory rose like smoke. She was 24, standing in the lobby of a luxury hotel in Geneva for a conference. A clerk had looked her directly in the eye and said, "Deliveries are made at the service entrance around back." She had swallowed the humiliation then, a powerless graduate student. But she had used the poison of that memory as fuel. She had built her power from it, brick by painful brick, deal by brilliant deal. Until moments like this no longer had the power to break her. They only served to expose others. Now, in this gleaming hall of the future, the insult wasn't hidden in coded language. It was broadcast under a digital cosmos, recorded in high definition, and etched into the memory of every single witness. The floor manager, sensing the monumental shift in the room, lowered his hand and took a half-step back. "Ma'am," he began, turning to Tiffany. "Perhaps we should—" "There is no perhaps," she snapped, her voice cracking now, the desperation showing. "She leaves. Now." Tiffany didn't realize it, but the room, the night, the very narrative of her life had already slipped from her grasp. And at the center of it all, Saraphina James sat, a queen on an invisible throne, the storm of Tiffany's making swirling around her, waiting for her command to either dissipate or unleash its full fury. The gala had grown heavy, every digital star on the ceiling reflecting not just light, but a final, impending judgment. The billionaire's wife was vibrating with her Pyrrhic victory. And then, without raising her voice, without even shifting in her seat, Saraphina reached for her clutch. A single, slim phone, matte black and featureless, slid into her hand. She tapped the screen once. Her movements were not rushed, they were deliberate, serene, the actions of someone utterly in control. The guests leaned in, a collective holding of breath, straining to see, to hear. "Activate Aegis Directive," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational, the calm, even tone of someone ordering a latte, not summoning an earthquake. Instantly, a voice responded through a nearly invisible earpiece tucked in her ear. It was crisp, professional, and devoid of emotion. "Confirmed, Saraphina. Aegis is active. Gala systems are linked. Awaiting your command." She placed the phone on the table in front of her, screen up. It wasn't a threat. It was a quiet declaration of a new reality. Tiffany's triumphant smirk faltered, thinning into a line of confusion. "What are you doing? Calling for an Uber?" Saraphina didn't answer her. She spoke to the air, to the witnesses, to the digital ghosts in the machine. "Document everything," she said, her voice still soft, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "Every word spoken, every action taken tonight. Ensure there is a permanent, unalterable record." Phones, which had been recording covertly, were now raised high and proud. The young reporter on the mezzanine whispered urgently into his mic, "She's calling a directive. Something is happening. This is not a random guest. This is someone else entirely. The floor manager, who had been ordered to eject her, now shifted from foot to foot, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. "Ma'am," he started again, looking at Tiffany. "Maybe we should just—" "Quiet!" Tiffany snapped, raw panic finally bleeding into her voice. "She's bluffing. Just another pathetic social climber trying to look important with her little phone." But then Saraphina finally turned her head and looked directly at Tiffany. Her gaze was not angry. It was something far more terrifying. It was pitying. "Bluffing doesn't build empires," she said, her voice low, but every word cutting like a diamond. "And you just made your last move." The ballroom stilled. At the far end of the hall, the massive data screen displaying sponsor logos flickered. The logos dissolved, replaced by lines of code, scrolling too fast to read. Then it all froze, and a single block of text appeared. Apex Summit, Primary Benefactor Anonymous Pledge, 500 million USD entity, Aegis Global. A wave of gasps rolled through the room. Heads turned from the screen to Saraphina. Whispers erupted. "Aegis? That's her? 500 million?" Tiffany's champagne flute trembled violently in her hand. "This is ridiculous. Some kind of hack. Who let her—" Saraphina raised a single finger. A minute gesture that nonetheless commanded absolute silence. The voice in her earpiece spoke again, audible only to her. "All systems nominal. Internal verification complete. You have full control, ma'am." And in that moment, Tiffany von Aster finally, horrifyingly understood. She wasn't facing a target. She was facing the source. Saraphina's silence was over. The counteroffensive had just begun. The air in the sphere of tomorrow had shifted. It was now thick with the scent of expensive perfume, ozone from the electronics, and the undeniable metallic tang of revelation. The giant screen glowed. The words, Aegis Global, and the staggering $500 million figure pulsing like a new sun that had just risen indoors. Slowly, gracefully, Saraphina James stood up. The crimson stain on her emerald gown was a stark, brutal mark, but her presence, her sheer force of will, seemed to burn it away. Every single person in that hall, from the billionaires to the busboys, followed her movement as if compelled by an invisible force. She did not shout. She did not need to. Her voice, calm and clear, wrapped around the room like velvet chains. "You mocked the woman who underwrote this entire summit," she said, her eyes locked on Tiffany. "You called her an interloper, unworthy, out of place." A beat of silence, heavy as a coffin lid. "I am not a guest here," Saraphina stated, the words landing like hammer blows on stone. "I am the host." The room stopped breathing. Glasses froze halfway to lips. The holographic orchestra vanished, its light code dissolving into nothingness, plunging that corner of the hall into a stark, silent shadow. Saraphina took one step toward Tiffany von Aster. The click of her heel on the marble floor was the only sound in the universe. "I am the primary benefactor of this gala. I am the anonymous founder and CEO of Aegis Global." She paused, letting the weight of that name settle. Aegis, the most powerful and enigmatic data security firm on the planet, the invisible architecture that powered half the corporations represented in that very room. "And beyond that," she continued, letting the silence stretch until it became painful, "I am the majority shareholder in the parent company that owns the social media platform your husband just acquired for $3 billion, a detonation of gasps. A man near the stage literally dropped his glass, which shattered on the floor with a sound like a gunshot. The young Brazilian coder covered her mouth, tears of vindication welling in her eyes. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew she was someone." Tiffany's perfectly constructed face crumbled, the mask of arrogance dissolved, revealing the terrified, insecure child beneath. She stammered. That's impossible. My husband, our family, we control. You control 14% of the shares, Saraphina finished for her, her voice as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. A significant but minority stake. A stake in an enterprise whose core security, whose entire operational integrity, runs on Aegis platforms. Platforms that are licensed, not owned. Licenses that I have the power to grant or to revoke. The livestream comments on Marcus Thorne's feed were a waterfall of pure chaos. She owns them. She literally owns them. Not a guest. She's the goddamn queen. This is the greatest thing I have ever seen. The floor manager, who had been hovering uselessly, took a stumbling step backward, his face ashen. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Saraphina's eyes, cold and clear as a winter sky, never left Tiffany's. You see, you didn't ask who I was before you decided what I wasn't. You looked at my face, at my dress, and you wrote a story in your head. A story in which you were the princess, and I was the peasant. You never stopped to consider that you might be the jester in my court. Murmurs were turning into audible declarations. One investor said aloud, "She runs Aegis. She basically owns the digital backbone of this entire room." Tiffany's white dress now looked like a shroud. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice was gone. Her power, inflated by her husband's name and her own venom, had been punctured and lay deflating at her feet in front of the entire world. Saraphina didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply stood there, an embodiment of consequence, letting the truth reshape the reality of the room. "You wanted me gone from this room," she said at last, her voice soft but final. "But I am the foundation this room was built on, and tonight every single person here will remember that true power doesn't always wear the costume you expect." The simulated stars on the ceiling seemed to brighten, their light scattering like a million tiny spotlights across her emerald gown. The Gala, once an arena for Tiffany's cruelty, had just become the stage for her execution, and the world had shifted on its axis in a single, brutal heartbeat. The moment the words, "I am the foundation," left Saraphina's mouth, the social fabric of the ballroom didn't just tear, it disintegrated. Tiffany von Astor stood as if flash-frozen, her crimson-stained hand still clutching the champagne flute, a relic from a reality that no longer existed. Her face, a canvas of expensive makeup, was now a mess of raw, twitching fear. Her circle, the sycophants who had laughed on command, instinctively pulled back. Their movements were subtle, a step away, a turned shoulder, a sudden fascination with their own shoes, but collectively, it formed a quarantine zone around her. The safety of the pack vanished the instant they realized their alpha was nothing but a sacrificial lamb. One woman in a sapphire dress whispered to her husband, "Oh my God, Julian is going to be ruined." Another just stared, her mind furiously calculating the fallout, desperate to remember if she had been caught on camera laughing. The floor manager, the man ordered to be the instrument of humiliation, was now sweating profusely, his professional veneer stripped away to reveal a man terrified for his job, for his future. He stammered, "Ma'am, I had no idea. Forgive me." The words directed at Saraphina, a desperate plea for clemency. On the mezzanine, Marcus Thorne's live stream had broken the internet. The viewer count was skyrocketing into the millions. Comments scrolled too fast to be read. "Aegis Global, she's a legend. The Von Astors are cancelled. Emerald Dress CEO is my new hero." Marcus himself was whispering, his voice trembling with the sheer magnitude of the story that had fallen into his lap. "The tide didn't just turn," he dictated. "It was a tsunami." The orchestra remained frozen, a silent, holographic ghost. The guests were now a churning sea of reactions. Some began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence and fervor. Others were simply stunned into silence, their mouths agape, processing the sheer audacity of the reversal they had just witnessed. And many, many phones were out now, held high and proud, no pretense of discretion. This was history, and everyone needed their own copy. And the husband, Julian von Astor, the tech billionaire, seated at the head table near the dais, finally moved. His face was the color of ash. His phone had been buzzing non-stop in his pocket, a furious, trapped insect. He finally pulled it out, his eyes scanning the flood of notifications. Messages from his board of directors, alerts from his CFO, red downward arrows from his stock tracking app. The blood drained from his face. His wife's petty cruelty had just detonated a nuclear bomb in the heart of his empire. He tried to stand, to say something, to do anything, but the collective gaze of the room pinned him to his chair. For the first time in his adult life, his money was worthless, his power a phantom. His entire kingdom was dwarfed by the woman standing tall in a stained emerald gown. Tiffany, in a last desperate act of denial, whispered, her voice a ragged thread, "She's lying. It's a trick. She has to be lying." But not even her closest friends would meet her eye. They were already staring at her as if she were a ghost, the memory of someone who used to be important. The Brazilian coder, her voice now steady and ringing with triumph, stepped forward. "I'm a systems architect. I've studied Aegis's code. It's poetry. She's not lying. She is exactly who she says she is." The applause that followed this declaration was thunderous. Tiffany staggered back, as if she'd been physically struck. The room had rendered its verdict. Saraphina didn't raise a hand for silence. She didn't need to. The awe-struck hush that fell was more profound than any command. In that instant, Tiffany von Astor, her husband Julian, their entire circle, all stood in the rubble of the illusion they had so carefully constructed. The pyramid of power had been inverted, and every single witness knew precisely who now stood at the apex. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of a guillotine blade, poised and waiting. All eyes were on Saraphina James. She didn't look at the adoring or terrified faces in the crowd. Her gaze remained fixed, like a laser, on Tiffany von Astor. "You ordered me out of this room," she said, her voice dropping, becoming dangerously quiet. "Now I am ordering you out of your empire." A collective, shuddering gasp. It was a sentence of corporate death, delivered in public. Saraphina raised her matte black phone once more. A single tap on the screen. Her voice remained impossibly steady. "Terminate all active licensing agreements tied to the Von Astor portfolio, effective immediately. Revoke security access. Freeze all associated contracts. Alert the board that their chairman is now a security liability." The crisp voice in her earpiece crackled back, for her ears only. "Confirmed, ma'am. Aegis Protocol 7 initiated. It is done." At that exact moment, Julian von Astor's phone let out a single piercing shriek, a Priority 1 security alert. He looked down, and his face collapsed. "No," he choked out. No, this can't be." His voice broke. He staggered to his feet, then fell back into his chair as if his bones had turned to dust. Tiffany spun toward him, her eyes wild with panic. "Julian, what is it? Make them stop this." But Saraphina's words sliced cleanly through her plea. "You built your castle on my land, and tonight, the lease is up." The guests were no longer just murmuring. Some were clapping openly. Some were shaking their heads in sheer, unadulterated awe. Marcus Thorne whispered to his mic, his voice hoarse. "Contracts are being canceled. Live. On this stream. She just vaporized their entire corporate structure." Tiffany's face flushed a blotchy, terrified red, then drained completely, leaving her looking like a wax figure. She lunged a step closer to Saraphina, her voice a cracked plea. "You can't do this to us." Saraphina turned her body slightly, a gesture of final dismissal, not even granting her the dignity of a full frontal gaze. "I'm not doing anything to you," she said. "It's already done." Her earpiece confirmed it. Von Aster accounts locked, Horizon Project access revoked, automated notifications sent to the SEC, the financial press, and your legal team. The floor manager, who had once been ordered to remove her, now bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deference and surrender. The staff, all along the walls, stood straighter, a silent army that had just witnessed the fall of a tyrant and the coronation of a queen. Julian slumped further in his chair, his phone now a dead weight in his hand, displaying emails that were digital tombstones for his life's work. His empire hadn't just stumbled, it had been erased from existence in less time than it takes to make a toast. And Tiffany, once the glittering, cruel center of this universe, stood broken, her icy white dress now a costume for the most public and profound humiliation imaginable. Saraphina placed her phone gently back into her clutch. She didn't smirk. She didn't celebrate. She simply let the profound, heavy weight of justice settle into the chandeliered silence. The punishment wasn't rage. It was consequence. It wasn't chaos. It was control. Absolute. Surgical. Irreversible. And every single person in that ballroom finally understood. The real power had never been loud, had never been cruel. It had been waiting. Patient. Silent. Until the perfect moment to rewrite the world, the simulated stars glittered above, scattering fragments of light across a room that had just witnessed not just a confrontation, but a complete and total dismantling. The arrogance, the laughter, the casual cruelty, all of it had been flayed, layer by layer, in front of an audience of the world's most powerful people. Saraphina James stood tall, her emerald gown stained but her spirit incandescent, a beacon of unshakable strength. The crimson mark no longer looked like a stain of humiliation. It looked like a battle scar, proof that she had taken the enemy's best shot and had not only survived, but had emerged victorious and utterly untouched. She turned, her movements slow and deliberate, letting her gaze sweep across the entire ballroom. Every eye met hers. Guests who had whispered, who had smirked, who had stayed silent out of fear or apathy, now stared at her with a new expression. Reverence. Some looked ashamed, others inspired, but all of them were irrevocably changed by what they had seen. Her voice, when she spoke one last time, was clear, steady, and carried the weight of a fundamental truth. "Respect," she said, "is not measured by the diamonds you wear or the last name printed on your invitation. Respect is character. It is revealed in the dark, in the moments when you think no one is watching, in how you treat those you assume have no power." She paused, letting her eyes land one last time on the broken figure of Tiffany von Aster. Tonight, that choice defined you. And tonight, it ended you. Tiffany sagged against a nearby table, her white dress looking garish and cheap under the stark lights. Her husband hid his face in his hands, his phone still buzzing with the endless death rattle of his collapsed company. An empire built on code had been erased by a single, quiet command. On the mezzanine, Marcus Thorne spoke into his mic, his voice filled with awe. "This isn't a business story anymore. This is a legend. This is justice, delivered live to an audience of millions." His livestream comments had become a single, roaring chorus. "Power isn't loud. Emerald dress forever. This is dignity." Saraphina placed her phone back in her clutch, the soft click of the magnetic clasp sounding like the closing of a history book. She took a step toward the exit, and the crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Guests scrambled out of her way, creating a path, not out of fear, but out of a deep, instinctual respect. At the grand doorway, she paused. She turned her head just enough for her final words to slice back through the hall. "You thought my silence was weakness," she said, "but you were wrong. Silence isn't weakness. Silence is strategy, and tonight, underestimating it was your last mistake." What did you think of that ending? If you felt that wave of justice wash over you, let me know in the comments by typing power. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are building a community here dedicated to stories exactly like this one. The room finally exhaled, a collective release of breath it didn't know it was holding. Applause rose, not the polite, scattered applause of a gala, but a raw, thunderous standing ovation. It swelled like a tide that could not be stopped. Phones stayed raised, not just to record, but to bear witness. The story was already out of the room, already rocketing across timelines, already igniting conversations in cities thousands of miles away. And Saraphina James, the woman in the stained emerald gown, walked out into the Dubai night. Unhurried, head held high. Her dress gleamed like the embers of a fire that had burned down an old world to make way for a new one. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't pleaded. She had simply demonstrated power, controlled, undeniable, unforgettable. Because justice doesn't always arrive with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it arrives in emerald silk, with calm, patient eyes and a voice that never, ever needs to be raised. And in that ballroom, every witness knew they hadn't just seen a woman win a fight. They had seen the very definition of power change before their eyes. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay strong and remember the power of silence.